and Sarah. Right, I think we have Robert and Ning for Auckland Council submission on the Ministry of Transport's Hīkina te Kohupara kia Māori order Aotearoa, the transport emissions pathways to net zero by 2050. Very simple title. Cool, thank you. Presentation, everyone, so we'll just, once again, it's probably best to go right through the presentation, then we'll have questions at the end. Just indicate to me, or Suada Sophie, if you want to have a question. Cool, thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. We're here today to talk to you about the recently released discussion document from the Ministry of Transport, Transport Emissions, Pathways to Net Zero by 2050, Hīkina te Kohupara. Submissions on this are due by the 25th of June, that's 2 weeks from now, and we're seeking your delegated authority for some of your members to provide direction for us over the next week or two as we prepare the submission and to ultimately approve the final submission. So we'll take you through the key elements of this document today and our proposed response to them via our submission. But before I hand over to Ning to do that, it's just worthwhile giving you a little bit of context for this document. So this document was not released in isolation. It's part of a wider government response to the Climate Change Commission, which released its final advice yesterday to the government. We expect that a number of other government agencies will, in the near future, release similar documents setting out pathways to emissions reductions in their particular spheres of influence. So it's not an isolated document, it's part of a wider response. Ultimately, this document and others like it will lead to the production of an emissions reduction plan by central government, and it's legislatively obliged to do so by the end of the year as it issues its response to the Climate Change Commission's advice. The document itself, it's a very important document. It's quite unlike anything that we've seen from central government agencies in the past in terms of the tone, the breadth of action that it sets out, the depth and the level of detail it goes into in terms of the actions required, the urgent action required to essentially transform our transport system over the coming decades, years and decades, in order to give us a chance, really, of reaching our stated climate goals. And by our, I don't mean just Auckland Councils, but of course the governments as well. The other reason why it's really important is because, as I've just alluded to, the government is, whilst this document is not government policy, the government is legislatively obliged to provide its own pathway to net zero emissions by the end of the year. Whether it goes with the Climate Change Commission's advice or some other pathway, we can expect that the emissions reduction plan that it produces by the end of the year, if it doesn't adhere strictly to the advice set out in this document from the Ministry of Transport, the actions will have to bear a fairly close resemblance to some of the things talked about in here. So we are developing a joint submission with Auckland Transport on this. We're aligned on this. The submission will reflect previous decisions by Council as respect of the climate plan, Te Taruki Tawhiri, and also, of course, our recent submission on congestion pricing that we made just a month or so ago. And just one last point here, it's important to note that whilst the range of actions set out in this document are really quite transformative, we're not necessarily getting ahead of public sentiment here. We've received strong public support for climate action through things like consultation on the Auckland Climate Plan, through consultation through the LTP, and through the feedback that Auckland Transport received on the RLTP, particularly in respect of strong support for better public transport and better public and better walking and cycling facilities. Before we get into the detail of the document, it's probably just worth pausing and changing tack just slightly, just briefly, on the final Climate Change Commission advice, which was released yesterday. So there are a few differences between the draft advice that was released last year, and you know, it's 480 odd pages. So as I'm sure you appreciate, we haven't read it yet. So we're just picking up on some of the media commentary and some of the bits that we have skimmed through. So there's a great, compared to the draft advice, there's a greater emphasis in the final Commission advice on mode shift and the need to reduce private vehicle travel, so mode shift to public transport, walking and cycling. And it sets out some regulatory, recommended regulatory interventions in support of that, including around targets for local government, of course, more funding for public transport, and removing some of the regulatory impediments that make it difficult for local government to act in this area. There's still a very strong emphasis on accelerating the transition of the private vehicle fleet away from petrol-powered cars to electric vehicles, and there's a couple of regulatory responses that it recommends in support of that, and I'm sure you've heard about the proposed ban on the import of petrol-powered vehicles in the 2030s. As regards freight, there's a greater emphasis in the final document compared to the draft advice on moving freight to low emissions modes, so rail and coastal shipping. So that's the Climate Change Commission final advice released yesterday, not to be confused, although closely aligned with the discussion document released by Ministry of Transport that we'll spend the rest of this presentation talking about. So now I'll hand over to Ning, who will take you through some of those details.
Kia ora koutou. So in terms of what the Hīkina Te Kohupara discussion document covers, it talks about all the interventions that are required to reduce our transport emissions, and it groups these interventions into three broad categories. So changing the way we travel, improving our passenger vehicles, and supporting more efficient freight. And we'll talk about the specific interventions in later slides. The discussion document uses the Avoid, Shift and Improve framework, which is a comprehensive and systems-wide approach to looking at how we can reduce our transport emissions. This is the framework that we've used ourselves in Te Tarukia Tawhiri. It's used by the Climate Change Commission in their advice, and it's also used internationally. And so there's three main components to this framework. Firstly, focusing on avoiding motorized trips in the first place. So be it through reducing the need to travel through work from home policies, or reducing the trip lengths that people have to travel through more compact, mixed-use urban developments. And then secondly, shifting to more efficient modes of transport. So moving from petrol vehicles to public transport, walking, cycling, shared mobility, from diesel trucks to rail freight, coastal shipping, etc. And then finally, there's a range of interventions under to improve the efficiency of the remaining travel activity. So that's really around increasing fuel efficiency standards, electrifying the fleet. The discussion document covers 4 pathways to get Aotearoa to net zero by 2050. So each of the different pathways plays slightly different weights on the Avoid, Shift and Improve range of categories. And it's important to note that, for example, for Pathway 4, it has very high focus on all of the interventions really, but particularly high on the Avoid and Shift suite of interventions, and focuses very much on early implementation as well in order for us to see the benefits of emissions reduction much earlier. So just quickly then on what this discussion document means for Auckland. As you know, Auckland has a much steeper emissions reduction pathway as encapsulated in Te Tarukia Tawhiri, which this committee endorsed in 2020. It aims for us to halve our emissions by 2030, and transport in particular plays an even greater role of having to reduce emissions by 64% by 2030. We think it is appropriate for Auckland to play a bigger role in emissions reduction. 22% of the national transport emissions are from Auckland, and Auckland also has a lot of the opportunities to shift people onto more sustainable modes because we've got the density to support that kind of action. But for Auckland to be successful, we really need government to also be equally as ambitious, to have ambitious policy settings, financial settings, regulatory settings to enable us to utilize the interventions that are within our toolkit to decarbonize rapidly. and equitably. So as you can see, just in grey, the Climate Change Commission's proposed national target for transport at a national level is about 12.5% versus our 64%. And as a result of our very ambitious emissions reduction goals, we need comprehensive actions across all agencies and all sectors. And in the transport space, different agencies have slightly different roles and responsibilities. And so a lot of the avoid and shift interventions are areas that local government has control over or has the ability to influence. But often we are constrained by things such as the availability of funding, so not enough funding for public transport, walking and cycling, for example, slow decision-making processes, whether it's internal or external, and in some cases, we do have community opposition to some of the interventions, particularly around road space reallocation. And this is something that we really need to address, really, to kind of bring our communities along in order to have to ensure that our decarbonized pathway is equitable and has longevity. But as Robert mentioned earlier, there is overall a lot of support for climate action from our communities and also from local boards as well. We're also hampered by committed investments that do not necessarily support our emissions reduction goals. And then under the improved range of interventions, this is where central government has more control over. But ultimately, all these agencies need to work together, and we have to pull all these levers as hard as we can. It's not about cherry-picking certain interventions, but really looking at them as a suite of interventions that require strong action on.
Okay, so we'll just take you, I'll just go back one, take you through our proposed approach to the submission. So the document sets out 14 questions that it would like responses to, and we'll do so. But we'll also want to put in a narrative of our own, that covers off some of the gaps that we think are in the document. So, as Ning mentioned, there are three key themes around which the interventions in the document are coalesced. The first of which is reducing private vehicle travel, whilst at the same time increasing accessibility and travel choice through the provision of better public transport, better walking and cycling facilities. Again, as I alluded to at the start, this is, as far as we're aware anyway, new from central government agency in terms of the explicit acknowledgement of the need to reduce private vehicle travel as a core element of our response to climate change. I think Auckland Council has been here for a little while now, particularly through our climate plan. It's good to see that a central government agency is responding along, thinking along similar lines now. So in the space, the document covers a whole bunch of interventions, some of which have the potential to have relatively immediate impact, some of which there's a long lag between decisions that might be taken in the near future and impact on the ground. So it's important that as we make decisions in these various spheres, and I'll go through them very briefly, that we keep those long-term emissions reduction goals in mind. So as I say, I'll just go through these very quickly. So the document is very explicit on the need to reconsider planned projects that will result in an increase in roading capacity and to reallocate that funding away to lower emission projects, public transport, walking and cycling. The document is silent, however, on the corollary of that, which is increased funding for public transport services. We need to, if we're to hit our emissions reduction goals and our mode shift goals, we need serious investment in improving the frequency of our public transport network, the coverage of our public transport network to hit those areas that currently have poor service, and provide them with an all-day, everyday, convenient alternative to private vehicle travel. One area where there is potential for quick wins is the reallocation of road space, and the document talks about this, and improved street design. So what we mean by that is reallocating road space away from parking, away from exclusive or the use for private vehicles, towards bus priority measures, for example, and safer infrastructure for walking and cycling. The document talks a great deal about that, and that's in line with Auckland Council's approach as well, of course. Another area where potential for relatively quick wins is in parking management. The availability of parking, the cost of parking, other restrictions around its use. So that's a short-term element to parking management. Longer term, of course, the way in which parking requirements are reflected in our planning documents, such as the unitary plan. And you will have opportunities to make decisions and provide direction in this regard through at least two key pieces of work that are going on at the moment. One being the response to the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, and the other being Auckland Transport's review of its parking strategy. So those are the interventions that have an opportunity for impact in the relatively short term. There are, however, another bunch of interventions, equally important, that where there's a long lag between decisions we make today and their impact on the ground. So infrastructure investments, of course, as we all know, there's a long lag between initial planning and decisions to go ahead with something and its impact on the ground, city rail link being a primary example of that. Road pricing. So this council recently gave its in-principle support to the idea of introducing road pricing in Auckland, subject to some very strong caveats around the need to address its equity impacts and the need to have sufficient alternatives in place so that people actually can change their behaviour and travel by other means. But road pricing is not the only means of encouraging people to change their behaviour. Of course, we have all sorts of programs that we could put in place in this respect. We've heard it said that we need something along the lines of the government's COVID-19 response, something to get the community behind a shared goal. Because without community support for all these interventions, we're not going to get anywhere, and we're going to have no hope whatsoever of achieving our climate goals. And lastly, a lever over which council, local government has really strong influence is, of course, land use regulation and our urban form. So decisions taken today in respect of urban form and our approach to planning today may be many years, if not decades, before it has a substantial impact at a regional level. So our urban form today reflects planning decisions of the past. Of course, we've seen since the unitary plan was introduced in 2016, intensification in certain areas around the region, and that's great. But in terms of a substantial impact on our urban form as a whole, that may take many years. And again, you'll have opportunities to make decisions in this area when you consider Auckland Council's response and implementation of the government's national policy statement on urban development. So we need to pull all these levers, both the short-term ones and the longer-term ones, to their maximum effect in order to get anywhere near our stated climate goals. However, as Ning alluded to earlier, there are a number of regulatory and process-related barriers inhibiting our ability to do so. And the document talks about some of these, and we propose that our submissions support them on this. So, for example, sorry, I've lost my train of thought a little bit there. Yes, sorry, thank you. So our slow decision-making processes, our sometimes cumbersome consultation processes, our business case processes, not just ours, but central governments as well, and the hoops that need to be jumped through before we can get decisions on any particular infrastructure program. The document also talks about creating targets for local government on PT uptake, on the uptake of walking and cycling. It talks about linking the availability of funding for specific infrastructure projects to the impact that project will have ultimately on our urban form. So, I mean, these are quite significant departures from what we've done in the past, but it's the kind of action, not necessarily the specific action, but the kind of actions that we need to consider if we're to enable people to get out of their cars and to start using PT, walking and cycling a lot more, which itself is a necessary step along the way to achieving our climate goals. So I'll hand back to Ning now to take you through some of the other aspects.
So the second theme in the discussion document that will form a key part of our submission is around the need to accelerate the transition to low and zero emissions vehicles. And given the very slow turnover rate of the vehicle fleet in Aotearoa, we support government putting in actions in place now to ensure that this acceleration does happen. The discussion document talks a lot about decarbonizing the vehicle fleet as really critical to meeting our emissions reduction goals, particularly for our 2050 target. But we believe that the strategies to decarbonize the fleet really needs to be combined with actions to reduce private vehicle demand. And that is because the more unconstrained our vehicle demand, the greater our decarbonization task will have to be. And with the uncertainties around technology changes, the ability of people to shift to electric vehicles, around the supply of electric vehicles to the market, that brings a lot of risk if we don't try to constrain private vehicle demand. We support what the discussion document talks about in terms of addressing the barriers to uptake of zero and low emissions vehicles. So that's focusing on the relatively high purchase price of electric vehicles compared to internal combustion vehicles. And we think that priority access needs to be given to low-income groups who will have a harder time in accessing these higher cost vehicles, even though the operational cost of it over time will be reduced. We also agree with what the discussion document talks about in terms of the need to address supply. And so one of the ways to do that is to implement the fuel efficiency standard, such as the clean car standard that the government is currently progressing. And that's really important to ensure that Aotearoa doesn't become a dumping ground for high-emitting vehicles as other countries start phasing out the imports of petrol and diesel vehicles. I'll stop there. The third really critical theme is around increasing the efficiency of the freight system. And so we're glad to see that the discussion document it places more emphasis on the need to decarbonize freight compared to what has been in the Climate Change Commission's draft advice. Auckland Transport is already working with the freight industry to support greater freight efficiency, for example, to green the supply chains, shorten supply chains. One example is the trial of a urban consolidation hub on Beach Road, where the last delivery mile is undertaken on cargo bikes. We think Auckland's highly urbanized nature, where a lot of our freight task is short and intra-regional, there is an opportunity to electrify freight vehicles that are meant for shorter trips, so more electric cargo courier vans, more electric cargo bikes, and also, particularly in our urban areas. We support what the discussion document talks about in terms of focusing on rail and coastal shipping, particularly for the longer regional trips. And we also support the use of low carbon fuels such as biofuels, hydrogen, for harder to shift freight tasks. So in terms of the equity impacts of the proposed pathway, the discussion document has a short chapter on ensuring a just transition. However, it's quite a light chapter. What we would like to say is that while it's very important for us to reach our emissions reduction goals, we also need to think about the outcomes, the future that we want for Aotearoa and Tamaki Makaurau. And at the moment, the transport system is highly inequitable. A lot of the externalities of the transport system is disproportionately borne out by more marginalized groups because of where they are geographically located, perhaps. They have more exposure to deaths and serious injuries caused by traffic. They have more exposure to air, noise pollution. They also have poorer access in general to opportunities and poorer travel choice. So we think that low carbon transport policies that really tries to increase accessibility and choice for everyone can address our current inequities. But it's really important that equity to be front of mind when we're developing these solutions, and for the right voices to be at the table so that the solutions that work for communities can be built into our decarbonization pathways. In addition, rural communities will also have a different set of transport needs, different to urban areas. And so in rural areas, perhaps it would be things like on-demand shuttles to bring people in more dispersed locations to bring them to access the backbone of our rapid transit corridors. So while most of the low carbon transport policies can help address current inequities, there is specific mitigation required for road pricing, as Robert already mentioned. So we will be emphasizing that in our submission. With regards to partnership with Māori, the discussion document talks about the need for Te Tiriti or Waitangi to be the base of our decarbonisation pathways. We think that it could have stronger emphasis on how that could be implemented. We take our guidance from Te Tarukia Tawhiri, which embeds Te Ao Māori in the development of our climate plan. And we believe that a tikanga Māori approach that takes in Te Ao Māori values, such as kaitiakitanga, whanongatanga, can really help to ensure equitable outcomes for all. Really key to that is to ensure that there is partnership with Māori, so that there are Māori voices at the table to embed Tauranga Māori into our emissions reduction plans. We see opportunities currently, for example, through the formalization of the Tamaki Makaurau Mana Whenua Forum's inclusion in participation in the ATAP governance group as one of these co-governance opportunities that can continue to support iwi and hapu to build on their existing climate action. So just a couple more slides on the pathways itself. I won't talk about the pathways again, basically 4 pathways. And this graph is interesting because it shows the relative impact of each of the pathway and also the relative weight of avoid and shift versus improve. And so you can see that pathways 1 and 4, and 4 especially, has the greatest emissions reduction potential. The Ministry of Transport also, based on the analysis, found that pathway 4 is the most cost effective. And that is because it avoids the need for these emissions to occur in the first place, rather than mitigating emissions that come out from existing transport activities. So you reduce the need for additional infrastructure to mitigate against emissions. This shows that another representation, but ultimately pathway 4 is the only pathway that meets the Climate Change Commission's interim target. This is nowhere near as steep as what we have for Tamaki Makaurau, but because of its focus on early implementation, its focus on avoid and shift especially, and its cost effectiveness. That's all right. Because of that, because of all those reasons, we recommend pathway 4 as the most appropriate pathway for Aotearoa, noting that we in Auckland have an even steeper decarbonisation pathway. So quickly on next steps, next Friday we aim to circulate a draft submission to elected members and the Independent Māori Statutory Board for feedback. Once we have the delegated group to finalize the submission, hopefully you'll receive it either 23rd or 24th of June, and then a reminder that the submissions close on the 25th of June.
Cool. Thank you very much. That was obviously a pretty comprehensive presentation. I guess the main point at the end there, so I'm hoping for not much debate, is the fact that we've already approved a plan which has much stronger targets than what is being presented in this plan. Although this is fantastic from Ministry of Transport, actually our goals and actions and targets are greater than even Pathway 4. So the other indication I've had is from Councillor Darby, and it was probably an accident because they were in the earlier meetings on this, is that Councillor Darby and Bartley would like to be on the delegated group, and unfortunately Councillor Bartley couldn't be here today, but she did give a lot of, and thank you for including the suggestions around communications and actually behaviour change and what drives that especially around the equity issues facing Tamaki Makaurau. Right, I have 4 or 5 questions, but if we could keep it tight, that would be great. Councillor Henderson first.
Thanks. Couple of questions. Pathway 4 here, you've got on slide 18, assumes very high pricing. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that, because that could bake in some serious equity issues for particularly West and South Auckland with lower socioeconomic neighbourhoods.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. So you're right that Pathway 4 does have very strong assumptions around pricing. And even though it meets the Climate Change Commission's interim target, the Climate Change Commission's pathway actually has a much stronger focus on EVs in taking the weight of decarbonization. The Ministry of Transport one is much more focused on reducing private vehicle demand. And so these are the assumptions that they've included in the modeling for the pathways. So not all interventions have been modeled. And so I guess pricing has been used as a proxy to shift behavior change. We have our position through the in principle support for congestion pricing, as in Auckland Council has its position, which is that there needs to be, before congestion pricing or road pricing is implemented, there needs to be mitigation of these equity impacts, so ensuring that there is good alternatives for people on those corridors before any pricing is implemented.
I'm sorry, one more question, thanks Chair, and then reserve my right to speak, because I do plan to vote for it, but I've got some concerns that I probably need to express. But my question is thus, look, talking about feedback here, and we've got some really consistent feedback from Aucklanders over and over again. Support the climate goals, support mode shift, support all of this stuff. Really strong, very good. But this is in a context of innovating streets programs across Auckland that have been hugely controversial. So I'm wondering, and I'd like your thoughts on this, are people supporting this in the abstract but not their local neighbourhoods, or is it a bit more complicated?
Yes, that's right, and that's a key question, and I'm not sure we have an answer for that, because yeah, you're right. It's very easy to support these things at a high level, but as soon as they start impacting you on the ground and your how you go about your daily life, then it can become a different matter. So I think that just well, a couple of things. One, we hear some very loud objections to innovating streets, and been some recent examples, obviously. We don't know for sure necessarily that captures the full extent of community views on whatever the project happens to be. So there's that. But two, it really places the emphasis on what we were talking about before around the need to work with the community. So in the instance of specific projects, to make sure that we get it right, and to talk to the community, work with them to make sure that we do just that, and that projects are put in the right place and they're conceived of in the right way. But more generally, we talked about those behaviour change programs, and I think the Climate Change Commission talked about something similar as well. I think they talked about some kind of agency set up around climate change to get people on board with the longer term targets. So I don't really have I don't think anyone would have a full answer to what you've just asked, but it's a really important consideration. Yes.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Dalton.
Thank you. The just transition, which is question 12, is a really, really light chapter. And I'm wondering what evidence we've got that we can provide around what a just transition looks like for Aucklanders.
So there has been various pieces of work looking at the equity of the transport system, and most recently a piece of work that was commissioned by the Ministry of Transport looking at the equity of Auckland's transport system, and it found that there are, so it looked in particular at transport disadvantaged Aucklanders, which is where you don't have choice and you have poor access to opportunities using alternative modes, and they also looked at people who are impacted by transport poverty, which is when you try to mitigate against your low level of access, you are forced to pay more for example, forced car ownership. And it found that the current transport system could definitely be better in mitigating against equity impacts, and has some suggestions on various policy recommendations that could help to do so. So I think we can pull some of the evidence from that report in particular.
I would like that report to be used when you're having a look at your feedback on behalf of all of us, because it is pulling those groups that Councillor Henderson has just spoken around, and we make decisions based on what we say people want. People want to be able to catch the bus and want to be able to cycle, and we're actually only talking to half the population because that part of the population isn't informing the transport planning. I have another question. The freight efficiency, is that an emission reduction or efficiency and productivity? Because the decisions around that, and I will take Mill Road as the example, cancelling Mill Road contradicts both, right? Because what we're doing now is we're increasing emissions and we're reducing efficiency. So how, even when trucks transition to a different fuel, they will still exist. How have you had feedback from the trucking industry as to how they're going to adapt their business models? Because we talk about they can go on the trains or they can go on the ships, but trucks are going to want a truck. That's not going to change. Do you know what that looks like in terms of numbers when we look at providing the roading infrastructure for the future, cars and trucks on hydrogen or electric?
I'm not able to answer your second question, but in terms of the first one, we do know that the freight industry support, for example, road pricing measures, so travel demand management measures that help them to use the existing network much more efficiently because there's less competition from private vehicles. So the
My right to speak.
That's okay. In terms of the efficiency, what it means exactly, the discussion document talks about increasing the efficiency of the supply chain. So that's more around shortening it, not duplicating routes, for example. There's a whole bunch of work that will be pulled into a national freight strategy that will be developed by government.
Did you also want to mention about the 80% of trips that could be mentioned in the around freight?
Yeah.
The low-hanging fruit type.
Sure. Yes, this is information from Auckland Transport, where about 80% of the freight task is intra-regional, so within the region itself, and mostly quite short. And so there are opportunities to, the technology is already there to support them to transition to low emissions vehicles. But I take your point that they are still vehicles in the end. Yeah.
Next, Councillor Newman.
Two things as a preamble to the question, because it strikes me, in reading Hīkina Te Kohupara report, the document from the Ministry of Transport, two things emerge. Firstly, in relation to really tough issues of equity, what tends to happen is that we raise it up and become so abstracted that we look at the headline numbers so that we don't have to confront the reality that the policy settings are so grossly unfair, usually targeting those people who are transport poor. And the second thing, that in relation to who has the power to make these decisions, that's never going to be a fair reallocation of power. We saw that in terms of a mode shift option around Mill Road was significantly gutted, and yet we're going to have a pedestrian cycleway bridge bespoke across the Waitemata Harbour, arguably for people who have the most choice. So we have a problem there. And it seems to me that the pathway for in this document, whether it's focusing on switching from EV, or the focus is on moving away from a mode shift from private vehicles to public transport. We've got a regulatory setting, but you know what? You know what's missing? There's actually no funding to achieve it. And Councillor Dalton's talked about the issue in relation to Chapter 12, and I think that that's a very fair point. Is the bulk of our submission actually going to address the fact that there is a dearth of means to actually fund an alternate to what we do at the moment? Because what we do at the moment is a result of the fact that that's how we design it. there is no choice for those who are poorest to enjoy the choice that is experienced by those who have the most. And unless we deal with that, it seems to me that we're writing a submission in relation to a document that actually has no relevance to to half of Auckland until it comes time for them to suffer a bit more. And I'd like to see us address that as the key focus of our submission moving forward. Can you comment on that?
Yes, so putting aside specific projects, whether it be the Northern Pathway or Mill Road, just putting that aside for the time being, yes, in short, in answer to your question, funding, and particularly operational funding, is a gap in this document, and it's something we intend to highlight, because the types of improvements envisaged in terms of services and frequency and so on require a whole lot more funding than is currently available.
I don't think it's a gap. It's an ocean. It's so big, and it's that gap is delivered through subsidies. You don't have the subsidy there, you will never address the gap, which then means we'll start to go back up the Amscat because this becomes too hard.
Yep.
It's a debate point.
Yeah. But debate later. But if you have another question, yeah. Cool. Walker, questions only, and we will have a chance to debate, but just want to stick to questions for now.
I've got a number of suggestions I want to make in terms of additions. I mean, I can ask that as a question, but that's the appropriate time, so I'll just make them, okay? So picking up on Councillor Newman's issue around funding, as far as I'm concerned, that's the most significant thing, and tying the funding on our part to all of the levers that we need to pull, because all of those levers pretty much need funding. So I just want to emphasise that. In terms of other things, there's very little mention in the document around ferries. They're almost non-existent. So can we beef that up? Because if there's one thing that we could and should be delivering on around Auckland, it's ferries, as it goes to both the Waitemata and the Manukau, and maybe one of these days the Kohupara, in terms of ferry services. And quite obviously there's a related issue around ferries as it goes to funding. The other issue that goes to funding is the need for both OPEX funding, but also capital funding or access to money so that we can invest in, for example, ferries, because the private sector is unlikely to invest in those ferries themselves without some form of assistance. The other area that really concerns me that could and should be beefed up is, and this goes to your comment around all the levers need to be pulled to maximum effect, and that's around carpooling, car sharing, because if there's one thing that you can do very quickly, and again, it comes back to subsidy, it's that.
These are definitely points we can add during the debate. If you want to keep it more succinct.
Well, it's easy to do it now.
Well,
Mr.
no,
Chair.
we just wanted
Either
questions of the officers. So many of the points.
Well,
I'll
just pick up in comments.
Councillor Walker. Many of the points you've said were covered in the presentation of what's included, what is going to be included. But if you could present any finite questions to the officers on the submission or the presentation, then they'll be able to give you that. Otherwise, we can pop it into the debate. Are there any more questions?
I'll just do it in the debate then. That's fine. Okay. Well, I'll just ask it as a question then. Can we have more emphasis on mobility as a service as it goes to priority access for low-income groups?
Yes, we can, and it's one of a whole range of measures that will need to be investigated and implemented as part of our response, as part of our action plan, if you like, to help achieve our climate targets, and ferries are certainly another as well.
And the other question I've got, and it just goes to this notion of making better use of carpooling and the like, can we place emphasis around those things that can be delivered at speed to make a difference?
Yes, so as the distinction we tried to draw in the presentation and in our report, and also we propose to do in the submission, is between those things that will have that we can do relatively quickly and will have an impact in the short term and the longer term measures, and carpooling, as I say, could be an example of a whole range of measures that can be done that on their own may not have a huge impact, but combined together are important.
The last question I've got, I see very little in the report around benchmarking with other cities. I mean, we're a big city. We exist alongside other cities. It's one of the really effective tools for picking up on innovation, because other cities are doing, frankly, much better than us.
Yes, so point taken. We can note that as well. Talk about that as well.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. Member Wilcox.
I'll save my carbon credits for the delegated working group.
Kia ora. Deputy Chair, Councillor Coombe.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for the work on this. I appreciate there's a lot to bring together and a lot going on at the moment. I just had a few questions, and I just wanted to start with just to clarify, because Robert, you have kind of picked it up, but I don't know if it was totally clear to say you started talking about the public sentiment in terms of huge support for our climate plan, etc. But just to clarify, you're saying it's kind of a weakness in the document that it doesn't talk about behaviour change and how we bring our communities along with us. And I think this was a point that Councillor Bartley made at our pre-brief on this, that we need to, like, there needs to be a whole different approach to communication and how we get communities, as she said, normal people, to come along on this and to appreciate, well, to assist, to just communicate in the same way we've done a COVID response that brought us along as a team of New Zealand, and we need something similar. So just to clarify, is that something you're suggesting we actually beef up in the feedback?
Yes, that's exactly what we're suggesting, and yeah, we'll take your direction on that as part of the delegated group.
Yeah, I think that was a really good point how Josephine put it, and so keen for us to pick that up. In terms of the council levers and needing to pull on everything, and reconsidering road projects, and I appreciate the sensitivities around this table, but of different projects, I do wonder, just in terms of our own understanding of different projects, like, we have never actually had a full briefing on what many of these projects are, and I just think about, say, Penlink, which is just need to mention the word Penlink, and that gets people very kind of excited, agitated maybe, but I've never ever had a briefing on that project. I've never understood what it's intended to do. I do know there's big issues in terms of it doesn't connect to a part of Auckland that is intended to be a growth area, and so it is a project that has doubled in cost. So is this an opportunity for us to understand better how all of these projects sit together in terms of giving our feedback on what might need to be re-looked at, or why we would want to keep supporting projects? And I totally understand too, the sensitivities around the bridge project, but I just think we've never been briefed together in terms of the context of how all of these things sit. So, to sort of avoid us poking sticks at these different projects for another year, I'd much rather that we're all on the same page so we can understand them. I'd love to have a briefing on them.
So yeah, as you say, this document does talk about the need to reallocate funding away from increasing roading capacity. It doesn't talk about specific projects. However, in order to consider the emissions impact of a specific projects, we'll have to change the way that we do things, because it's not a routine part of the business case process, as I understand it at the moment, to do an audit, if you like, of the emissions impact of any proposed projects, whether they be public transport, roading, or whatever. So to give you the full briefing that I think you're asking that you would like, part of that would have to be, what is the impact that a particular project will have on Auckland's regional emissions profile. And other than at a relatively abstract level, as I say, we don't do that at the moment. When I say we, I mean the transport system as a whole. And that would need to change in order to enact some of the things that are suggested in here.
Okay, I guess to put the question
Yeah.
another way, the submission isn't going to focus on specific projects or provide
No.
commentary. So members around the table don't need to feel that is going to be relitigated through this submission process.
That's right.
But kind of put it on the table that at some point, huh? Yeah, no, but I guess what I'm putting on the table is I'd like to really be briefed as part of, I think it would be useful for all of us to be
I
properly
think
briefed.
this is probably a debating point too, Councillor,
Yeah.
not a question.
Well, it was a request, I guess. Just a couple of other just short questions. In terms of the focus being very much on reducing vehicle kilometres travelled, is it right that about 20% of trips in Auckland are discretionary or under 5 kilometres?
I'm not sure about the proportion of trips that are discretionary, but I know that from the work on the congestion question, it's about 50% of our trips that are under 5 kilometers. So most of our trips are short trips.
Right, that's useful to know. And I just want to last question is just around how we're joining up our work. And I know everything is moving at speed, so this has been a real change of direction for the government to come up with this document. But are we joining up with the work that's been done on the statement of intent and what's in there around measures of reducing vehicle kilometres travelled? Is that all joining up?
Yes, to the extent that time is enabling us to do so. So yes, it is. I mean, AT is on board with our submission for this. They're helping us prepare it. It's a joint submission, and it's the same group of people talking to each other about the statement of intent as well. So I want to say yes, but ultimately, that's discussions happening at our level, but the final decision as to what is and what isn't in the statement of intent is that's decisions made above us, if you like.
Just a very last question is just around, is this also an opportunity in terms of our feedback to highlight kind of the good for business side of being on a pathway? And I think you touched on it partly around the freight, how the freight industry are already thinking about what is good for business with their transition. Is this an opportunity for us to beef that up?
It is, and as Ning noted, Pathway 4 is the most deemed by the Ministry of Transport to be the most cost-effective of the 4 options that it sets out.
Great. Kia ora, thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Bill Cashmore. Okay. Last question. So, sorry, Councillor Watson, you wanted comment, right? Not question. Cool. Councillor Darby, last question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Can I just go to Chief of Strategy? I think Megan's in a position to, because I have been asking for a workshop for many months for Wakakotahi, Ministry of Education, Kāinga Ora to come in and brief us on a range of things, and we have not had those workshops. And I'm hearing what Councillor Coombe is asking for, which I think we all need to hear of, but it does frustrate me that there has been no room in our calendar to allow for pretty fundamental information to come forward. I'll leave it with Megan to reply right now, then I've got a question, Chair.
Thanks. Through the chair, yes. Look, I'll take that on myself, Councillor Darby, in terms of not progressing that as quickly as you wanted. but I'm still working on that and looking to see in the next month if there's an opportunity to, at least with Waka Kotahi, have a conversation like you're discussing. Thanks.
You had Kiwi Rail to that too somewhere. Robert, this forms a strategic document at a really high level once it's all finalised, that all government, local government, will not just heed it, will have to follow in all its subsets of strategic documents. What worries me is that we've got strategic documents in place that actually go towards doing some of that, not remotely all of it. And it's something I need to raise with you again, Robert. I drew to your attention recently, it was just an informal discussion, the absence of any monitoring in any reporting on the 2019 Better Travel Choices, which was an agreed, Chair, it's agreed between some 8 parties. I think it's 8, including Treasury, Ministry of Transport, Auckland Council, Auckland Transport, Waka Kotahi, etc. And it has 28 recommendations for the responsible parties to actually start working on. And we've missed 3 reporting periods, I've just calculated. And Mayor, those reports were supposed to come to you and the Minister of Transport, and I don't believe they haven't come to the ATAP working group. I guess what I'm highlighting here, members, is it's one thing to have strategy, it's another thing to actually have the organisation and organisations respond. So, Robert, can you give us a sense of why we haven't responded to that strategy? And it does inform this. So there is a link to this. I'm not picking off anything in isolation, because it worries me that we build strategy, we confirm strategy, and then we conveniently address some parts of it and walk away from large parts, if not all.
Yes, so you're right. So in regards to the mode shift plan, Better Travel Choices, approved in 2019, there was a reporting framework put in place, and there was some initial reporting done on a quarterly basis, but that has fallen off the radar, probably because the people who would do that report were all tied up with ATAP. So there's relatively little explicit acknowledgement of that plan in ATAP. However, it was implicit in terms of the objective to around mode shift, that's in ATAP, and the focus of investments within ATAP. So within funding and other constraints that the ATAP process faced, there was certainly movement along lines that are consistent with the mode shift plan. But yes, to take your point, absolutely, it has fallen off the radar in an explicit sense. However, given what's set out in this document and what we know is to come in terms of the emission reduction plan, both at a national and a regional level, we can expect to see a lot more, I think, of that plan, and some proper reporting on it. And I also take your point more generally around the high level aspirations and how that doesn't always translate down. Well, I think the difference here, of course, is the legislative requirement that government actually set out its plan and then make progress on implementing that plan towards emissions reductions, and the 3-yearly carbon budgets that are part of that. So there'll be a whole framework and a whole set of mechanisms around how that's reported, and how elected members at both local and central level, and also their agencies, are held to account in delivering on that plan. So that's a huge step forward, I think, than where we've been in the past.
Thank you, Chair. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Councillor. Right, so I will just ask Robert and Ning to step back from the table. Thank you very much for all that information. And I will move, and Member Wilcox has seconded, and we'll go to Councillor Henderson indicated first.
Cool, thank you, Chair. Yeah, look, I do support this, but there's a couple of things I need to sort of just get off my chest. Well, when we're talking about mode shift, really we're talking about 4 problems the city has to solve, and I've sort of raised this before. Firstly, more routes for buses and trains where there are already routes, new routes where there isn't, cheaper fares, and that's an important one, I don't want to lose that one, that's very important, and bus driver working conditions. You know, we've talked a little bit in this debate around reallocating road space, and that's a great way to show leadership, and that's exactly what we're going through right now in Waitakere. But it's not low-hanging fruit. It's not the low-hanging fruit that we're talking about when you look at it through the lenses of the problems we're trying to solve. And related to that is I'm really worried that we're looking at too much stick, not enough carrot. We need to really help people and people with equity issues to get back into public transport. We're in the context of innovating streets, but we're also in the context of being unacceptably low public transport patronage compared to pre-COVID-19 levels. And we need to figure out how to win the hearts and minds of Aucklanders back on public transport and get them choosing public transport again, and to be rewarded to do so rather than avoidance of cost or avoidance of a punishment. I'm really concerned about where that could go, and I really want to make sure that our equity issues are sorted. The other thing I just want to point out is that I really like that we're not over-egging the electric vehicle solution, because that's a huge risk for us in the public discourse as we go forward. Because one thing electric vehicles do is they actually bake in future urban planning problems and bake in a reliance on the private automobile and congestion and city building that becomes a big challenge. So I really like that we're looking towards public transport and avoidance of trips. That's a really good thing, and happy to support this, but I do have some concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Dalton.
Thank you, Chair. And I just want to talk to the just transition part of this. So I support the submission that we're going to do, but again, I do want the group that are making the submission to look to the Equity in Auckland's Transport System report, which was commissioned by the Ministry of Transport and was released in December last year. And it shows very clearly the gaps that we have across Auckland. It talks about not having the evidence when making transport planning decisions for groups like Māori. It says further work is needed to fully understand how transport in Auckland is fulfilling Te Tiriti of Waitangi obligations. For low-income people, there is a gap in understanding how forced car ownership affects people's well-being. There is a lack of evidence as to how this is affecting low-income groups in Auckland. There's more work to be done to understand public transport equity in Auckland. For women, there's a gap in knowledge concerning the extent of forced car ownership relating to women's complex transport needs. They have more complex transport needs in the majority than other groups. There is no data about where LGBTQI people are more likely to live or how they travel. There is no known usable household travel survey or other survey data related to disabled persons' transport's choices and behaviour. The differential nature of older in Auckland is a gap worthy of exploring. There's not enough data. There is limited reference in literature to experiences of ethnic or racial discrimination or harassment in Auckland's transport system for ethnic minorities. That's a lot of people. That is a lot of people that we have no data on. We don't know where they are. We don't know how they're travelling. We don't know how they're not travelling. The report talks about not having the value of knowing how many trips are missed because of unaffordability or inaccessibility. It talks to transport poverty around low-income families forced into car ownership, which perpetuates the poverty they're in as they borrow money from loan sharks to purchase that car. And it talks about transport disadvantage, which are people who are using bikes, who want to cycle, but don't have the accessibility. So they can cycle locally, but they can't get into the trips that we are all encouraging people to make. So I really commend this report to have a look at what isn't being used when we're making transport decisions. There are 19 recommendations in full. There are 4 recommendations to the Ministry of Transport to take a more holistic approach when they're making transport decisions and coming away from just looking at the fastest way people can get anywhere to having a look at every person who lives in Auckland and how they can travel. And that will reduce our emissions. That will reduce the cars on the road. There will always be cars and trucks on the road. I get that we are going to reduce them and things are going to get easier, but we still need roading infrastructure to get our quarry trucks across Auckland. That will be happening for years and years and years. And unless we can help get the equity to people to transition to electric cars, it's going to take a long time yet before we get there. So, and I'll just commend this report and that it's used when you're doing your report back on Chapter 12. Thank you.
Good, thank you, Councillor. Where is Councillor Newman?
Chair, I'll need to actually vote against B on this, and the reason for that is that the decisions that have been taken recently in relation to changes in the NZ Up, I've lost trust. I need to say that, so I need to vote against B. The issue here is that the pathway for recommendation, I mean, that requires reducing nearly 40% of light vehicle kilometres travelled by 2035, that's in 14 years, and over 55% by 2050. And so, what do? We just raise it up, because when we actually confront what that means, it's so scary that we just take it to a very abstract level. Councillor Coombe, I'm very comfortable to look at the projects in detail, because when we look at the projects in detail, we have to look at the deficits too. And a Tesla costing $60,000 is not something that's going to be possible for most constituents in outer suburban Auckland. Neither is it possible for this council, given its current funding model, to provide an equitable allocation of funding for the infrastructure, for the development of the public transport network, let alone the subsidies to give people real choice to address the poverty issues that Councillor Dalton has rightly pointed out. I think that the Ministry of Transport has actually done a good piece of work, Chair. It is a good piece of work because it does start with looking at the weightings to focus on the avoid and shift initiatives to reduce the number of vehicles. And I get what Councillor Bartley has raised at the pre-meeting run-through around the need to take the community along. I think this is, Chair, I actually think that this is an area where there could be a growing level of disconnect in the community around what is conceived and, as what is desirable from a policy perspective around reducing emissions and the implications for people in their communities, not just around what happens in Onehunga. You can look anywhere. I mean, I've just article online, 1,000 people signing a petition in Gore in relation to their streets alone. I mean, Gore's only about 12 or 13,000 people in total. 1,000 people because of the planter boxes in Gore and in Invercargill. And you bet your bottom dollar, this is going to be an increasingly difficult exercise, strategic interventions in urbanism for different outcomes. This is going to be really hard, and it's harder when you see some of the decisions that are taken, which frankly I think offend notions of equity. So thank you, Chair, for allowing me to voice my concern. I support the work that's gone on here, but given the decisions that have been taken recently, I have a real concern about pathway 4, and I need to express that in accordance with, and give my vote to reflect that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor John Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And firstly, just a very good presentation by the council officers today. I thought that was quite helpful. And in particular, I think that the notion of getting communities on board, it just staggers me how little communication, effective or otherwise, there is with communities in terms of how people might make their contribution to climate change goals, and particularly in that avoid and a shift approach that we discussed today. So there's a whole lot of practical things people could be doing now if it was getting communicated to them that they actually should be doing it if they're serious about climate change. For instance, someone working for home for one day, essentially that's a 20% reduction in their transport emissions one day. If they catch a bus one day, similarly, if they do both, that's 40%. If they avoid driving the car to the dairy and walk or cycle, well, that's another thing again. Collectively, that can be quite significant. It doesn't apply to a lot of people, but it applies to a lot. But the absence in communicating that to people, you know, despite all the, you know, the rafts of policies and reports and discussions and browbeating, is really quite staggering. I would suggest there is a responsiveness out there. It's just not getting communicated to people. So I thank the officers for highlighting that avoid and shift and that kind of practical approach that could be starting now. And a number of those things without any great budgets. We have declared a climate change emergency. We talk about cycling and walking, yet most streets around Auckland, except those out in Herald Island and Whenuapai, have footpaths already that people could be walking on, or at a pinch they could be cycling on. Why don't we change the law and put a little line down the middle like they do in Japan, that a shared space, walking, cycling space, where the onus is on the cyclists to give way to the pedestrians at all time. That could happen now. So avoid and shift, let's start doing it now. I similarly agree with the need to really understand some of these projects that bigger projects that admittedly we don't have much briefing on, but some of the comments are really quite concerning, given that there is information on these projects online, adequate information I might add. But if we take Penlink as an example, for instance, it is a growth-related project. The whole driving force behind Penlink is to divert the Whangaparaoa traffic to enable this massive growth that's occurring in Milldale and Millwater, which amounts to over nearly 30,000 people. And similarly, being a peninsula, there's not a lot of road allocation that can take place. It's one lane for most of the way. So if you want to access the Northern Busway and get a cycle connection there, that also comes into play there. So maybe it would be useful to get a little bit more basic understanding of some of these projects. Councillor Newman and Dalton have made very good points about the whole equity issue, and I'm kind of reminded of that biblical verse there from Matthew: whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And I see quite an element of that around in a lot of the discussions in terms of what choices some communities have and others don't have. So I agree, there has to be a reprioritisation, all right, but it might not be in the way that some of the advocates there think so. It needs to be to the outer areas, which people like Rod Carr have certainly acknowledged needing the most help, not necessarily the ones who have choices of buses, trains, walking, cycleways and all the rest of them. So bring on the reprioritisation, I'm all for that. Finally, I just finished up, Mr Chair, I was listening to Rod Carr and James Shaw today talking about the latest report that's come out, and in terms of the way forward, certainly what struck me about that was the very real possibility that, the replacement, notwithstanding the financial hurdles of the capital outlay to start off with, is going to come from a reallocation of the combustion engine component as it compares to electric and hybrids. So I think I got the number right, but by 2050, I think Rod Carr was talking about like a 60-40% split. So these vehicles aren't just going to suddenly disappear and we don't need roads. There are waves of technology that will come that we have no insight to at the moment that will result largely, I think, and certainly from what Mr Carr was saying, and Mr Shaw for that matter, in a massive uptake on these kind of electric and hybrid alternatives that will, sure, the combustion engine will go, but they will be there and they'll still need the road space and everything else that goes with it. So that's about all I wanted to say, Mr Chair, but I think certainly from what our officers, let's get on to the avoid and shift like this afternoon, because there's a whole lot of things and perhaps a lot more innovative than we've had so far that could be getting done there right now.
Thank you, Councillor. Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, Mr Chair. And I'm going to be very, very brief. So the report's good. It actually personalises everyone's responsibility around climate change. and that's critical. So it's not just someone else's fault or problem. Everyone has a role to play, and what John's just said is true. So that's good. However, I have some real big concerns around the productivity measurements. So New Zealand currently sits at number 44 in the OECD for productivity. Ireland, for instance, is 14. We've been just going down for over 25 years. So we have a productivity problem in this country, and it's nowhere better accentuated than in this city. We also need to look at what are the essential ingredients for productivity increases. What are they, where are they? And we need to accentuate that through this sort of work. The other things I would say, and finishing up, is we need that equity lens, and that's what's been mentioned with that is absolutely critical. Some people just do not have any choice, and others are spoiled for choice. And we need the costings and affordability lens. It's all very well to talk about electric vans and things like that, but they are 2 to 3 times the price of a combustion engine. And you go to hydrogen, it's 4 or 5 times the price for the heavy boys. So there's a real issue there around capital availability going forward. So yeah, good work, me and Robert, but we need to really focus on some of those better social outcomes going forward, and equity, and the essentialness of measuring everything on a productivity lens as well.
Thank you. Mayor Goff.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I support the 3 recommendations. The first and the third speak for themselves. The second I support because actually we've got to support the things that will now make the most difference. The time to talk idly about other options and painless ways of doing this are actually gone. We either accept some pain now, some cost now to make the changes, or we pay a whole lot more, actually in financial terms later on, to fix a problem that's got worse and worse. And this isn't about us, it's about the next generation and the generation after that. I don't think we should get down to particularising around particular projects. That's not what this paper is about. So it's not about Mill Road, or it's not about Penlink or anything like that. What it is about, though, and there are 3 things that I think we probably need to strengthen in it. The points, 2 of the points have been made already. This will require funding, and that means from government, but it also means from us. So let's not pretend that we can put it all on the government and then say, well, but we're not going to do anything more about that. So we're going to have to front up to the funding. It is about equity, and equity actually means it's not how far you are from the city. A lot of us are a long way from the city, but we're not the people that need the handouts. It is about equity in terms of people who will find the adjustment to the new requirements unaffordable because they don't have the income to afford it. But the third thing is about, and somebody made the point before, might have been Bill, about personal responsibility. I listened to Wallace Chapman last night on his panel as I was fighting my way through the congestion on the motorway. And he asked the 2 people who were both articulate, middle class, reasonably well-off people, well, what are you doing about climate change in your personal life? And the worrying thing was that neither of them could think of anything. And, you know, it's kind of reminds me of the Kennedy thing, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Actually, we're all going to have to take some of the pain. There is no gain without bloody pain in this. We are at the hard edge of having to deal with climate change. It's no good us sitting around pontificating, passing resolutions unanimously that we agree that that we have a climate emergency, unless we are prepared ourselves and collectively to do something about it. I just want to make one other point. Shift and avoid. Avoid and shift, that were, I think, were the 2 things. Downplaying improve. Well, maybe you can downplay improve, because by a decade out, car manufacturers across the world won't be producing petrol and diesel cars. They've said that. Ford, General Motors, the European manufacturers, so people are going to have to move to electric cars, but they are even more so because electric cars don't per se solve congestion. We're going to have to put more, in particular, into public transport. Public transport is how we help the outlying area. The inner city area, we can talk about walking and cycling in particular. So, look, I think the recommendations are right. This is not a time to go soft and say Some people, look, I agree with what Shane was saying. It's bloody awful. We're all in favour of doing something about climate change, but please, not me. Somebody else has got to do it. And it's a bit like that about the congestion in the local areas. We want to have quiet streets, but actually we don't want to stop traffic. Well, sorry, they are two contradictory things. In the end, you've got to make the hard decision. And that's what we've got to do here, make the hard decision, because the soft decisions no longer exist around climate change. So I support the recommendations.
Thank you, Mayor Goff. Tracy Mulholland, Councillor Mulholland.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to members of this governing body. I've listened to everything. Thank you to the staff for your report and the information. Thanks, Councillor Newman, for that very helpful information. I'll be supporting you and not voting for B, and that is because I have deep concerns about equity for my constituents, about the social outcomes, about really, the issue around climate change and what it does mean, and where we've been going, and how many times we, as a community, having to pay for mistakes of the past. So I also think that we have a lot more work to do on public transport, and we could have done a lot better, and we should be doing a lot better, and we should be putting our money where our mouth is on more of that. So that is my view for my community, and I am happy to stand by that, so I'll be voting against B. Thanks.
Kia ora. Thank you, Councillor. And with no more... Councillor Darby.
And just very briefly, I want to acknowledge the Mayor's quite strong statement there. Mayor, I think you've summarised the enormity of this issue in a few phrases there, and I really take my hat off to you. Members, we're going to have to pull together on this. There's going to be quite a bit of turmoil in the short term if we are to have a lot less, and there won't be turmoil, it'll be catastrophe in the medium to long term. And this is going to require really just hard yakka leadership like never before. If you think dealing with COVID was a bit hard yakka, multiply it, a few thousand times for a much longer period. Now, there's been a lot written about this recently, about the need for leadership if we are to, well, you can't head it off because it's in our face right now, but to lessen the enormous impact that climate change is having, but will have on us. So, yep, there's going to be some challenges on equity. That's just one area. There's going to be many, many challenges ahead, but if we argue about why not to do something, the risk of significant catastrophe just grows and grows and grows. And it won't be anybody around this table likely that is impacted by that catastrophe, but it'll be children, grandchildren, and it'll be a hellish existence. Now, I'm not saying that, all the research says that. So a hellish existence because of inertia on our watch, or at least better outcomes than what our young people and those yet to come are facing. We've got some stark choices to be made by us.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Simpson.
Yeah, thanks. Look, sorry, I've lost Nexus about half an hour ago, and I'm just trying to get someone to come and get it back, so I've lost a big part of the report. I obviously support where we're going to on this, but I'm really worried about how we're going to afford to do it. I'm just saying that in honesty. We've struggled even in just in the last LTP. Look, I've listened to B. I suppose in principle is a way I thought it was written in such a way that the devil is in the detail. Daniel, the devil is in the detail. Yeah, well, I've just lost it. So I think I am struggling with B myself, Mr. Chairman. I am, for two reasons. Just that I'm not convinced that the detail is going to work. And I'm not convinced that we can take Auckland with us yet. We haven't got to that point. I want to. I do have some nervousness around it, so I'm sorry. And I would have done more, but I've just, as I said, completely lost Nexus.
Thank you, Councillor. And yeah, I'll just speak briefly. Remember, this is not our plan. The document is not our plan. Our plan is actually much stronger than Pathway 4. Our Te Tarakia Tawhiri actually says go faster and harder and more aggressively than Pathway 4. And we unanimously supported that. We also unanimously supported halving our emissions by 2030. We also, and I know it depends on who was in the meeting, but unanimously supported the climate emergency. Anyone can vote on which way they want on this, but this is our submission to the government's submission, report. And what we are telling them is, as we have every time, Te Tarakia Tawhiri was very strong on equity. Our submission on the congestion charging is very strong on equity and having infrastructure in place before we start ramping up congestion charging. So this will continue. Our submissions can only be written, not from my head or anyone else in the delegated group. Our submissions can only be written based on our current plans. Pathway 4 supports the Auckland plan. Pathway 4 supports the unitary plan. Pathway 4 is not as strong, but it supports Te Tarakia Tawhiri as well. And also remember, Te Tarakia Tawhiri's feedback broke records for Māori and Pacific engagement and our engagement from young people. There were more submissions in favour of Te Tarakia Tawhiri from Māori and Pacifica people from our communities than European Pākehā peoples. We also had the strongest question ever on the climate initiatives through the long-term plan. We also had support last year in the emergency budget for the climate initiatives in that package. Also, all the Kolmar Brunton, not just ours, but the wider study on climate shows that climate is up there in one of the top things that people want us to address. But to what people have said around the table and what Councillor Bartley, and unfortunately she couldn't be here today, spoke about is that we need to get it across how we change and what that is up to. On the individual thing and individual change, I do get a little bit annoyed sometimes that we do rely too much on the individual. What we absolutely need is council, government, business, everyone making system change so people have options. And this is actually what the document from Ministry of Transport says, but also what Te Tarakia Tawhiri says. We have to put the things in place so people can access the change and the options they need. We can't just expect people who don't have the options to change on an individual basis. But the other thing is, the week or 2 weeks before we were elected in 19, I walked down the street with the 50,000 people in the climate strike, mostly young people, but not all, who are demanding us to act for their future. And I think that this submission, combined with all the other great work we're doing as a city and as a country, is supporting that. So I don't think necessarily, and if we do talk about projects, we're also being told that we're not doing great in that space, even with those NZ up changes. Only 4% of our total budget, when you include the Northern Pathway, only 4% goes to walking and cycling. And it's only 1.2% of the government's transport funding across the whole country, including the Northern Pathway. Only 1.2% is on walking and cycling. So we're not talking about, lots of people seem to pick single projects out, but overall we are well behind where we need to be as a country. So I hope you can support this. This is a submission, but it will only be based on the previous plans we've all democratically pushed through before. So we're not doing anything different. This is not controversial. This is not actually out of everything we've already passed. So by supporting B, you're just supporting an A and C. You're supporting our decisions we've already made as a council. So thank you very much. I've moved this and Member Wilcox has seconded. All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? So there's no on B. So there's 4, Councillor Stewart, Simpson, Newman and Mulholland like their notes against B. Thank you very much. Perfect. And I'm so sorry, I assumed we were finishing earlier, so we've had absolutely no break. So we're just going to quickly pass item 12. Can I have a mover? Walker, seconder. Deputy Chair, Councillor Coombe. All those in favour of the items? Those against? No. And no consideration of extraordinary business, so we have closed. Thank you so much for that marathon, and you have the rest of the afternoon off. There is, will be, not off, but not at this meeting. There is food in the Councillors' Lounge. Thank you.